On Saturday night, Simon and Phil went to the late movie at the DeWitt Shopping Plaza Cinema. Before the film started, the two stopped in at Burger King, where Simon, now a regular as a result of his mother's recent cooking binge, exchanged friendly greetings with the manager. In contrast to the day before, Phil had nothing but praise for Nathan Krupman and his movie. And I parked the wreck, and I'm not in a very good mood, because it's 5:30 in the morning, and I'm not too big on Queens at any time of the day. So I walk into the park, and I almost drop down dead. There it is! Troy in all its glory! The walls, the horse, everything! And the cast, hundreds of us, and all people I'd seen around the school. It was amazing! They had armor for me there, and weapons, and the shoot! Oh, wow! We got it all in only one take, which is a good thing because on my order, we set fire to the whole city! I'll tell you one thing. Nathan Krupman's a great man. He's a genius. That's all there is to it. Today was the most moving experience of my life. Pass the ketchup, said Simon sourly. He had been secretly hoping the film would be an inconvenience and a bore, and that Nathan would turn out to be a jerk. Now to hear Phil tell it, everyone who had missed it might as well die. Phil seemed to read his thoughts. Oh, don't worry, you're sure to be in the next shoot. He's doing Woodstock, so he'll need a lot of people. The high of Phil's weekend didn't last very long. On Monday, the news came that his potential as a sculptor had come to naught, and that Garibaldi was a no-go. Phil was 100% prepared for this, and spent his lunch hour with T.C. Surratt. The two worked out a plan where T.C. would try to keep Phil in Nassau Arts on the grounds that he was switching his area of concentration from sculpture to poetry, where Phil assured the agent he was bound to show potential. T.C. wasted no time in setting up an appointment with the admissions director, and in less than half an hour's negotiations, Phil Baldwin was still a Nassau Art student, pending an interview with the head of the poetry department. The cost, upfront 3 days accommodation for T.C. at the Baldwin house, and 3 more days upon Phil's acceptance into poetry. Phil, weak with relief, was more than happy to oblige. This switchover did not affect his standing in his and Simon's math class, where the second week's homework turned out to be even heavier than the first. But, as poetry students were known for their resourcefulness, Phil had a solution to this problem as well. He and Simon drafted Wendy Orr, whom Phil knew from Nathan's shoot, into their homework pool so that now the load could be split into thirds rather than halves. Wendy, who was president of the Nassau Art Student Council, specialized in dance, and while Phil claimed that she joined the pool through the sheer logic of the situation, Simon was convinced that her partnership with him came largely from the fact that she knew he and Phil hang out with Sam Stavridis. What is it with you that you always think the worst of people? Phil accused as the two headed for their lockers right after Wendy's enlistment. I don't always think the worst of people, said Simon defensively. I just get suspicious when we're trying to discuss divvying up the homework problems and she's firing off questions about Sam like an SS in an interrogation team. Simon's biology class restarted that week, Miss Glandfield having recovered from her emotional upset. She had apparently decided to hold off on the 10-ton flame balls upon seeing that Interflux seemed content to level only 75% of the woods. The southernmost quadrant, the part nearest the school, was left standing, which she interpreted as a goodwill gesture on the part of Interflux in response to her own personal sanctions, for she had phoned several times to tell them about it. Being on the inside of things, Simon knew that the surviving trees had only been granted a grace period, as Interflux intended to start construction on the area they'd already cleared before flattening the rest of the grove. On that day, Miss Glandfield divided the class into lab pairs, which was how Simon became acquainted with Johnny, his partner. Johnny led somewhat of a double life. since in school he was Jonathan Zulanovich, top student in the music program and one of the most promising classical guitarists in the country. But on selected nights and weekends, he became Johnny Zull, lead guitarist of Outer Nimrod, the most exciting and dynamic band in Manhattan's underground rock music scene. "I can't stand the sight of Long Island," Johnny announced with as much emphasis as he and Simon gathered equipment for their first experiment. "What a hole!" Stunned that Johnny should feel moved to make such a statement apropos of nothing, Simon could only manage a weak, "Huh?" Johnny pointed out the window. "Look at that! It makes me sick! A plastic civilization with paper dolls for people. They're all dead out there. They think they're alive, but they're dead. The only thing that's real on Long Island is the boredom. That's it. Nothing else." Is there somewhere better? The sheer absurdity of the question caused Johnny to squeeze his eyedropper, spraying vicious red liquid onto Simon's shoes. "The city, man! New York! That's what life is about! But not the city they show in the tourist booklets! The real city! Tenement housing, cracked sidewalks, garbage, cockroaches, rats! That's real! To freeze all winter and sweat all summer and write great songs by the light of a bare bulb in an 8x8 cold water wall cup with crumbling plaster and bad plumbing. That's living!" Simon was sure it wasn't, but said nothing and concentrated on applying the liquid to the leaf on his slide. There was no reaction from the leaf, but his shoes were starting to steam. "In the city, if you got something to say, you go right ahead and say it in 5-foot letters on the subway wall. On Long Island, you don't say anything. You sit at home worrying because you didn't buy your kid a personal computer when he was 3, so he won't get into the college of his choice, and he'll end up stupid enough to wear plaid shirts forever. In the city, you wake up because the breaking pavement outside, or because someone heaved a brick through the front window of the deli you live over. On Long Island, you sleep through the alarm on your $1,500 Piaget watch, but some poor dog half a block away is driven crazy by the sound and smashes his head against the fence until his brains are scrambled. I hate Long Island." Simon, weary of this speech and more than a little nervous about his shoes, said, "If you hate it here so much, why don't you move to the city?" "Because my mother says if I move out before I graduate, no one's gonna feed my fish." "Oh, it was gonna be a long semester." Both Simon and his father were delighted that night when dinner turned out to be roast beef, signifying the end of the vegetarian era. For the time being, at least, they would not have to plan their evenings around the all-important visit to Burger King. In keeping with the mood, the conversation was light. After dinner, though, Mr. Irving, able to enjoy his coffee on a truly full stomach for the first time in a week, grew chatty. "Work was like a zoo today. Remember those exotic trees the Flake sent for the office on his trip to that Bengali village? Well, it turns out they had microscopic baby lizards living in the trunks. We found this out because the first wave of microscopic baby lizards grew up into not-so-microscopic adolescent lizards, and now they're all over the building. My secretary went home screaming. At least I think she went home. It's entirely possible she's still running." Mrs. Irving laughed. "Sounds like we'll have to call an exterminator, dear." "We did, but when we tried to explain our problem, the idiots wouldn't come." "You know, Dad," grinned Simon, "you shouldn't be surprised if Long Island exterminators aren't always prepared to handle Bengali lizards." "Yeah, well then some ninny in production got into his head to phone the Flake in Burma, who for some reason is proud of himself like he created a new form of life. He immediately called the Bronx Zoo and donated his lizards to their collection, so now we can't use an exterminator. We have to catch them and keep them. Well, my whole executive staff, they thought that was just terrific. You take a guy who spends 8 hours a day in offices and boardrooms and give him his chance to roll up his sleeve and chase lizards, and before you can say, what about the Atkinson contract, he's crawling under desks and tables with an empty mayonnaise jar looking for big game. What a mess! Maybe you should get some tsetse flies for bait, suggested Mrs. Irving thoughtfully. Mr. Irving shrugged in exasperation. I suppose I should be grateful. I've only got the flake's lizards. I could have the flake, too. 3 students were in Karada's classroom the next morning before the artist's arrival. Simon and Sam were standing with Peter Ashley, who was showing them his new painting, an abstract. Abstracts were high-risk projects in Karada's class, since the artist had never in living memory approved one, and made no bones about his conviction that most abstracts were done by people who couldn't paint real things. Who could tell? Sam shrugged. This might be one he actually likes. I like it. Peter shook his head. I don't know why I painted it. He'll probably give it one look, stomp on my desk, and say, Mr. Ashley, when I was at the South Pole teaching penguins to paint, there was this one little fellow who insisted on painting abstracts. It was because of this that I learned that penguin tastes a lot like chicken if you do the batter right. Simon laughed. I really like it, Peter. I know it's impossible, but it even seems kind of familiar. A mischievous smile played around Peter's mouth. It's a real estate map of Greenbush. My sister works in the town hall and she showed me one. I kind of liked the shape, so I transferred it to canvas, jazzed it up a little, and here it is. Instant recognition came to Simon. The abstract matched exactly the real estate map that Cyril Irving had up on the wall of his study at home. Mr. Irving's map had the Interflux proposed expansion drawn onto it, but otherwise it was the same map, with the same land lot boundaries, except for... What's that thing, Peter? Simon pointed to a small worm-like shape on the canvas, which, if Simon's guess was correct, jutted out from what would be Nassau Arts property and meandered out in a fair distance in an uneven crescent. Surely it isn't a land lot? Peter frowned. I think it is. Oh, yeah, I know that place. That land is the big joke of my sister's office. Back in the 20s, old man Schuyler won 3/4 of an acre in a poker game, and he took it in this crazy shape just to be a pain. It's the most useless lot in town. Part trees, part scrub, and part swamp. No one's owned it since the old man died, and ever since then, the town's been trying to unload it on someone. They've got it up for $6,700 back taxes, but nobody's offered 67 cents for it. Who would? How big is that strip? Sam asked curiously. Peter shrugged. Thin. From what I've heard, it's about 40 feet at its widest point, but usually it's more like 20. As for the length, I really couldn't tell you. You want to buy it? Are you sure Interflux doesn't own it? Simon asked. Peter nodded and pointed to his picture. All the Interflux land is black with orange flames. That strip is pink, which means it's town land. I was pretty careful about that kind of stuff. All morning, Simon was haunted by the image of that wiggly strip of land. He was positive it didn't appear on the diagram in his father's study. And he certainly had spent enough time staring at that map while Mr. Irving had gone on in excruciating detail about the proposed complex. According to Mr. Irving's map, Interflux owned all that land. Interflux owned all that land, but Peter's version said they didn't. Wouldn't it be a hoot if... Nah, it couldn't be. Still, Simon couldn't get the two maps out of his mind. He kept trying to place one over the other, but whenever he did, he ended up with the same impossible result. Every one of the proposed access roads to the Interflux construction sites at some point crossed over Old Man Schuyler's big joke. Was Interflux capable of such a blunder? Cyril Irving always said, in business you leave nothing to chance. Then again, Interflux had bought all its Greenbush land 30 years ago, and for all anyone knew, the buyer could have been careless and overlooked this strip. Simon smiled. Tonight he would tell his father about this, and if it turned out that Interflux had made a mistake, he would bug him about it for the rest of his life. The Nassau Arts Cafeteria, unlike its counterparts in most high schools, was a splendid place. The ceiling was largely glass, so the room was flooded with natural light, and the walls were decorated with vivid murals painted by students past and present. Sam Stavrinidis always ate at the table closest to his own contribution, a giant camel, and it was there that Simon and Phil found him at lunch. Soon the three were joined by Wendy Orr, her best friend Barbara, and the quarter-ton couple. Barbara was an attractive redhead, reputed to be a top-notch dance student, and generally known as the quietest girl in the school. During the whole lunch hour, besides hello, her entire conversation amounted to pretty good, which she said twice, once to how are you, and once to how's the salad. She spent the rest of the time staring at Sam. The quarter-ton couple, however, had only eyes for each other. Dino and Dina were truly a match made in heaven. They were both operatic vocal students. He a tenor, she a soprano, both greatly talented. The tag quarter-ton couple came from the fact that his weight hovered just below 300 and hers just above 200, so that theoretically, if you got them on the same scale together, the reading would be right up there around 500 pounds. They liked each other just fine that way, and so did the voice coach, who felt that great body mass yielded depth and resonance. Wendy was complaining about her job as student council president. This school is the pits for student government. I can't get anybody to work. There's no social director, TC makes the student council obsolete, and my vice president is a complete write-off. What we need is a combination treasurer program director that can make good use of the student council's money. While officially it seemed as though she was throwing this position open to anyone, it was clear to Simon that she had the job earmarked for Sam Stavrinidis. Sam, however, showed no signs of volunteering and sat passively eating his soup. What kind of stuff did you have in mind? Asked Dina between bites of a 24-inch hero sandwich which she was sharing with Dino. You know, dances, parties, social stuff, the things normal schools do. Just because we're Nassau Arts doesn't mean we have to be boring. We've got a fortune in the treasury and nothing to spend it on. How much the fortune? Asked Phil. More than $6,700. Simon choked on his Pepsi. What? How much? From her purse, Wendy produced a gold bank book and consulted it. $6,734.18. You're kidding! What are you so surprised about? Everyone here is so concerned with his own specialty that there's no involvement and the money builds up. Simon could barely keep himself from screaming, I want to get involved! I want to be treasurer! Wendy considered this. Have you ever had any experience at student government? Well, thought Simon, it was time to lie. Oh, sure, I was vice president of my last school. I worked on the organizing committee for school clubs. I was chairman for prom night. I organized rallies for the football team. And oh, wow, Wendy exclaimed, looking at Simon with a newfound respect. You're really an expert. Simon nodded brazenly. Sorry for the exaggerations, Wendy, but this was important. It was a sign. It had to be. Not 3 hours after we had found out about the Schuyler land strip from Peter Ashley, here was Wendy with a student council bank account containing exactly enough money to pay the back taxes and snap up the land that Interflux forgot. Obviously, this was a setup from no lower office than heaven. Interflux had been writing The Interflux had been riding too high lately, and now it was time for someone to give it to him right in the zipper teeth. Why tell Cyril Irving about the Schuyler land when Simon was only a few slightly dishonest dealings away from the money to buy it himself? Yes, he had to get his hands on that $6,700. Okay, where's the money? Wendy looked at him quizzically. Why? What's your hurry? A slow smile came over her face. I get it. You have so much experience with student activities that you're already having some fantastic plan. And you got it. Well, let's hear it. I'm dying to know. It's a secret, but I can assure you it's going to be memorable. So what we have to do right now is go to the bank and sign the account over to my name because I want to get started with the preparations right away. Eat up and let's go. Phil spoke up. What's so urgent that it has to be done this minute? I mean, Simon signaled at him madly and he fell silent. I know, it's a party with a beach theme, and it has to be soon so that it's still warm enough to wear bathing suits, right? Something even better than that, Simon promised. He picked up his own tray and hers as well, even though she was only half finished with her dessert. Come on, if we can hurry, we can hit the bank and still make it back for next class. Hey, Simon, called Phil, from one friend to another who's about to come into money, before you leave the country, remember who your buddies are. The wreck could use a little body work, you know? The account was in the bank at the nearby DeWitt shopping plaza, and Simon wasted no time hustling Wendy into the Firebird and roaring off, leaving a good deal of tire tread in the Nassau Arts parking lot. For whatever inexplicable reason, Wendy's opinion of Simon was inflating with each passing minute, and the sight of his black and red sports car helped this immeasurably. It was almost as though she thought she believed he had somehow acquired the car as a result of his now legendary career as a student leader. The bank transfer was done swiftly, and in a matter of minutes, Simon had acquired Wendy's counter-signature on a blank check, delivered her to her locker, made a motion to visit his own, doubled back, ducked into a washroom for a few minutes so she wouldn't see him leaving again, and then scooted back to the car. On the way to the Greenbush Town Hall, Simon had a brief attack of conscience. How could he do this to his own father? The answer came from Cyril Irving's own mouth. In business, you leave nothing to chance. Interflux had left this to chance, and this was fair game. The Greenbush Town Hall was really an old wood frame house originally owned by the Schuyler family and donated to the city in 1904. It was neat and respectable, but it had a vague air of neglect about it. The paint job was obviously old, and weeds were beginning to choke out what little grass showed between the unpruned rose bushes. Inside, there was even less evidence of order. The office employees, numbering 3, ran around a lot, looking very busy, but not seeming to accomplish anything. The telephone rang constantly, but was never answered. Eventually, a very young clerk noticed Simon standing by the front desk, and soon she and her 2 fellow employees were involved in a lively debate over who was in charge of the land office, and having settled on someone, which filing cabinet was the land office. While this was going on, Simon had a chance to examine the bank book, and noticed with some shock that Wendy had put his name down as Irving Simon. He wondered why the bank teller hadn't said anything when he'd given his sample signature. He sincerely hoped that it was assumed he'd signed his last name first, because it would be a tragedy beyond words to pull off the coup of the century, only to find that his check had bounced. By this time, the 3 had still not located the land office files, but had come up with the official town real estate maps and charts, not to mention the results of the 1909 town vote on indoor plumbing. They were against it 95 to 87. Even from a distance, Simon could see the long, thin, erratic strip marked down on the map to the northwest of Interflux property. Lot 1346B, he said, in a voice that impressed him with its steadiness. I hear it's available for $6,700 in back taxes. I'm interested in purchasing it. You're kidding! The three clerks began to stare at Simon and giggle. Is something wrong? Now the three laughed out loud. The senior clerk consulted a large ledger marked strangely Mahjong money April 81 to October 82. The back taxes are $6,708.35. I'll take it, said Simon, and the two junior clerks ran off to a back room and slammed the door. Howls could be heard. So it was that Simon found himself filling out the documents for the purchase of Greenbush Land Lot 1346B. Under the heading company name, he printed on a wild impulse Interflux and listed himself as I. Simon, program director, and gave the address of the school. Then he made out the check, handed it over, accepted the title deed, and fled. As soon as he stepped out the door, a horrible thought occurred to him. What if he'd been wrong about the map in his father's study, and he'd just converted the entire student council budget into the most useless piece of real estate on Long Island? So strong was the feeling of dread that that he drove straight home. Luckily, his mother was out, which saved him from another lie, explaining why he was home in the middle of the day, and why he was pounding up the stairs to his father's study in such frantic haste. He burst into the room, took in the map, and almost collapsed with relief. He'd been right. Better still, Interflux had been wrong. He drove back to school, flooded with the greatest sense of accomplishment he'd ever experienced. Phil caught Simon just inside the door leading up from the parking lot. Hey, he called, jogging up. Then in a lower voice, well, come on, how did it go? Simon looked startled. Oh, save it, I'm not stupid, you know. It was the most obvious thing I've ever seen in my life. You really had Wendy going with all that student activity stuff, which, no offense, I thought you were shoveling on a little thick, but she actually bought it. Any idiot could see you were making a move on her. Simon's surprise was genuine. What are you talking about? I wasn't even thinking about Wendy. Huh? Don't tell me you really want to be Wendy's school treasurer then. Oh yeah, I can't believe it. You mean you want to be cruise director on the good ship Nassau Arts? You're actually gonna organize a dance? Of course not. Then why did you kidnap her away from lunch and haul her off to the bank? What did you need that money for? Simon grabbed Phil by the arm, pulled him into the nearby washroom, and checked the stalls to make sure no one else was in earshot. Land. What? Land. I took the student council's money and bought land. Phil's face drained of all color. You mean land as in property? Yeah, land. How much of the budget did you spend? All of it. Oh my God, you were supposed to make parties! No one said anything about buying land! Phil, I know exactly what... Okay, don't panic. It's not too late. We can weasel out of the deal. We'll go back to the guy who sold it to you, give him a little song and dance about temporary insanity, and get him to take it back. We can bring TC with us. He'll make it sound better. We'll end up with him staying at our houses for a year, but at least we won't have any more land! But Phil, this is very special land. Phil held up both hands. I'm not questioning that. I'm sure it's just terrific land. But good land, bad land. You don't buy land with the student council's money. Phil, shut up and listen. Here's the deal. Simon related the story of Interflux's oversight and the bizarre-shaped parcel of land that was so vitally located. He carefully avoided any reference to his father. That's the land I bought. There isn't a kid or teacher in this school who hasn't got a gripe against Interflux. But if I'm right about this land, and I'm sure I am, Interflux can't build any of their new stuff without permission to drive trucks over our property, which means when they start expanding, we'll be in a position to hassle their brains out. The shocked expression on Phil's face dissolved into a toothy grin, and his eyes took on the look of someone who opened up a bin marked sheep manure and found it full of gold bars. They really need this land? They're in trouble if they can't cross it. Ha! And they can't cross it if we don't let them. Well, not us exactly, Simon explained carefully. Not the student council, that is. I bought it under a company name, Interflux. Phil laughed with delight. It's the perfect name, but what for? We're hassling them, remember? When they hear the name, they'll get the message. Wow! When I first saw you in that parking lot, thumbing your nose at Interflux, somewhere in my mind, I knew there was something cool going on. I mean, it's tough to look dignified thumbing your nose, but you had the form. And now, 2 weeks later, you've got Interflux in a chokehold. Man, the more I think about this, the more I like it. When we tell Sotrius, he's gonna freak out. Phil was disappointed in Sam's reaction. You guys are nuts, Sam said firmly. Missing Karada's class for nothing is nuts. Blowing the school student council's money because of Peter Ashley's abstract painting is nuts. Trying to mess with Interflux is nuts. Interflux is nuts. But don't you see the beauty of it? Crowed Phil. I see that when you tell Wendy you bought land with her party money, your life won't be worth 2 cents. But when I explain, Simon began, Schuyler Avenue is paved with the bones of people who tried to explain things like this to Wendy. She's a little high-strung, you know. The girl has the temper of Mount St. Helens and can smoke at the mouth for twice as long. She'll probably kill you first and then have your remains thrown in jail because I don't suppose you thought about this, but what you did was illegal. No, it wasn't, Simon defended himself. I'm the program director. This is a program. Call it what you like, but remember, that girl can get nasty. Quit scaring the guy like that, laughed Phil. This'll just take a little explaining, that's all. Wendy was in the dancers' warm-up studio when Simon and Phil found her to explain the events of the day. Simon spoke clearly and reasonably, discussing in great deal all aspects of the situation. Unfortunately, he had no way of knowing that she and Barbara had already phoned Bloomingdale's Collect to punch up their wardrobes in anticipation of the many smart social events at the school. She was very quiet, so Simon was unprepared when she picked up a textbook and flung it at his face. It was such a good shot that it knocked him backwards into a row of chairs. Then Wendy, who looked rather good in a leotard, although this was a strange time for Simon to notice it, gathered everything portable within reach and pelted it at him, hurling abuse with assorted tap shoes, ashtrays, clipboards, music stands, and cups and glasses. Land! Running out of projectiles, she made a dash at Simon directly, and the last thing he saw before she descended on him like a vulture was Phil strolling nonchalantly out the student door. Land! Throwing chairs effortlessly out of the way in a show of strength that was amazing for one of her trim size. Wendy grabbed Simon by the collar, hauled him to his feet, wrapped him in a microphone cord so tightly that he couldn't move his arms, and pushed him down again. Then she snatched up the nearest fire extinguisher and emptied its contents over his inert form. Shouting, "Land!" one last time, she snatched up an old ballet slipper, stuffed it into his mouth, and walked off in a huff, leaving him lying there trussed up like a turkey in a pile of foam. She let you off easy, Sam said later. It was he and Phil who came to rescue Simon after the battle was over. Thanks for the support, Simon gasped at Phil, shaking himself like a dog and spraying foam far and wide. Phil grinned. We were outnumbered, one of her and only 2 of us. I had to go for reinforcements. We'd better get you cleaned up, Sam observed. Simon nodded breathlessly, some of the enchantment gone from his day. He noticed that his nose was bleeding all over his shirt, gave the fire extinguisher foam a pinkish tint. Hey, look on the bright side, Phil wisecracked. The hardest part is over. From here on in, it'll be smooth sailing for Interflux. Simon nodded again. It was true. If he could survive the type of punishment that Wendy Orr could dish out, what had he to fear from the mighty Interflux?